Here's the rule for adding two signed numbers. Now the rule seems a little bit cumbersome, and it is, but it's the accurate way of doing this. Let's try a couple of examples and see how this is going to work. So what we're going to do is maybe, how about for number 1, we do something like this. Let's take 8 plus 6. Now, we all know this is 14, but here's how we're going to get it using the procedure. Right, so what it says to do is to add, we're going to add these two numbers, 8 and 6, and they have the same sign, right? They're both positive. So what the rule says to do is this: add the absolute values of the numbers. So the first thing we want to do is get the absolute value of each number. Now look, this is the first example, so it starts off relatively easy. So let's get these absolute values. So the absolute value of 8 we know is 8. The absolute value of 6 is 6. And now what the rule tells us to do is to add the absolute values of the numbers. So let's do that. Let's add these. So we're going to add these together, and we'll get 14. Then the rule goes on to say, once we've got that sum, right, associate with the sum the common sign. So with this sum, we're going to associate the common sign. Now they have the same sign, which is positive, so we're going to put a plus sign here, a positive sign. Now, because it's positive, we don't really need the sign. So what we're saying here is this, that 8 plus 6 is 14. Now we knew that, but what we're doing here is just illustrating the rule. Let's try another problem. Here for problem 2, why don't we try this one? We're going to add these two numbers, -4 and -8. Now these two numbers have the same sign, right? Back up here, to add two real numbers that have the same sign. So we're going to add these two numbers, they have the same sign. And the rule says to add the absolute values of these numbers. So the first thing we want to do is get the absolute value of the -4 and the absolute value of -8. So let's do that. The absolute value of -4 we know is 4. The absolute value of -8 is 8. And then if we add these together, right, that's what we're supposed to do, add the absolute values. So if we add these together, we're going to get 12. Now the rule goes on to say, with that sum, 12, with that sum, associate the common sign. Now the common sign here is negative. So we're going to associate that negative with this 12. So what we're going to say here now is this: -4 plus -8 is -12. And that probably makes sense if you think of it this way. Suppose that you lose $4 and then you lose 8 more. So altogether you've lost $12, right? You've lost 12. So why don't you try these two here? Why don't you try this one here? Let's go with 5 plus 8. Try that one. And then try this one. -5 plus -4. And I'll give the answer in just a minute. So you might want to pause the video and then work them out. And then I'll come back with the answers. Here's what I'm thinking. This is equal to 13. And here's how I got it. The absolute value of 5 is 5. The absolute value of 8 is 8. I'll add those two together. That'll give me 13. And the common sign here is positive. So I'm going to get positive 13. And for this problem over here, the absolute value of -5 is 5. The absolute value of -4 is 4. When I add these together, I get 9. And the common sign here is negative. So I'm going to associate that negative sign with that 9, getting -9, so this is going to be -9. Here's the rule for adding numbers that have unlike signs. So you can see, in this case, we have a +5 and a -9, and here's the rule. The rule says to add, and that's what we want to do. We want to add these two numbers that have unlike signs, and they do, right, positive and negative. Subtract, so we're going to make a subtraction of the smaller absolute value from the larger absolute value. So again, as in numbers 1 and 2, we need the absolute value. So let's get the absolute values here. So the absolute value of 5 is 5. The absolute value of -9 is 9. Now, the rule says to subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger. So let's do that. Let's take the smaller, which is this one here, subtract it from the larger, which is this one here. So we're going to get 9 minus 5, and that's a 4. right? So we have subtracted the number with the smaller absolute value from the larger absolute value, and we got 4. And now, with this 4, we're going to associate the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. Now, the larger absolute value was 9. The number is itself negative, so we're going to put that negative sign. We're going to associate that with the 4 here. So what we're going to write here is that 5 plus negative 9 is negative 4. And it might make sense if you think of it this way. Suppose you've got $5 and then suddenly you write a check, say, for $9. Now you're actually down $4, right? You're down 4. Let's try another one. How about this one here? Let's add together negative 2 and 18. So these are two numbers that have unlike signs. This one's negative, this one's positive. So the rule tells us to subtract up here, right? Subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger absolute value. So again, we need absolute values. So let's do that. We'll get the absolute value of negative 2, which is 2, the absolute value of 18, which is 18, and now we're going to subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger. Now this is the smaller, subtract this one from the larger. So that's going to give us 18 minus 2, which is 16, and with that 16, we're going to associate the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. So here's the larger absolute value. That number is 18. It's positive 18. So we're going to put a positive sign with that 16. So since it's positive, we don't have to write any sign. And we're just going to conclude then and state that 18 minus 2 is 16. And if we rewrite it as the original problem is, we will conclude that negative 2 plus 18 is positive 16. So how about if you try these two here? We'll draw a line and separate these. How about if we try this? Let's go with an 8 plus negative 3. And then let's try this one. Let's go with, oh, you know what? We don't really need that parentheses. Let's just go with, say, negative 5 plus 9. So maybe work these out and pause the video, and then I'll come back and say what the answer is and how I got it. So in this first one over here, we want absolute value. So the absolute value of 8 is 8. The absolute value of negative 3 is 3. Then, if I subtract now the smaller absolute value, which is 3, from the larger, which is 8. So let's do that. Subtract the smaller from the larger. 8 minus 3, I get 5. And with that 5, we're going to associate the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. Now, the number with the larger absolute value is 8, right? That's positive. So with this 5 here, we're going to put this number sign positive. So we're going to have positive 5. So there we go. 8 plus negative 3 is negative 5. It is 5, so let's write it. We're going to have 8 plus negative 3 is 5. And for this problem over here, we need absolute value. So the absolute value of negative 5 is 5. The absolute value of 9 is 9. And if we subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger, right? 5 is smaller than 9. Say 9 minus 5, subtract the smaller from the larger. That's going to give us 9 minus 5. We're going to get 4. And with that 4, we're going to associate the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. Now, this down here is the larger absolute value. That's number 9, and that's positive. So we're going to associate with this 4 a positive sign. So we don't need to write the plus sign. We'll just say 4. So what we're going to conclude then and write is that negative 5 plus 9 turns out to be 4. And maybe it makes sense if you think of it this way. Suppose that you're down $5 and you come into $9, then you're up $4 altogether.